Hi guys, StatMat here. Now, just to prove that I don't always use obviously digital means through the emulation of Commodore 64 stuff, I thought I'd actually show you my setup today, especially as I've just received a couple of new things in the post from some very kind supporters, which we'll go over in a second. Now, obviously on the first thing, you'll notice on the right here, I have what is called an over voltage protector, and it's currently showing us that it's 5.19 volts. Travelling into it from, oh dear, an original brick. So yes, I decided rather than trying to go for an aftermarket power supply, which I know a lot of people are, sort of very keen on doing, we definitely know that we need to protect our old computers from these rather dodgy, cheaply, nastily made Commodore power supplies. But because I wanted to keep that and kind of have that, sort of show, it looks, in my opinion, looks pretty cool having the Commodore logo there on the top. Decided to invest in one of these over voltage protectors. Very well made, very kindly made for me by Copsec, who runs out of Spain. Really nice device, and obviously, just it gives me that reassurance that I'm not going to go and blow up my very trusty bread bin here. You'll also see at the back here, we have a very nice new shiny custom Space Pilot cartridge. And that's been sent to me by Hellboy73, one of the users from the Lemon 64 forums. Thank you very much, Hellboy. Basically, it's using one of the game from the Space Pilot game from the One Load 64 collection. So that's great. We'll have a look at that in a little second. You'll also see across here, we have a tape cart device that was sent to me by Raf from C64lover.com. Thank you very much, Raf. Allows me to test tape cart stuff when I'm doing stuff for the collection. And of course, right next to it, you'll also see the very wonderful Kung Fu Flash cartridge by Kim Jorgensen. It's a fantastic device. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, whilst lots and lots of people will tell you, hey, you should invest in an Ultimate 2 or these kind of things. And of course, they are fantastic devices in their own right and very much more feature rich than the Kung Fu Flash. Given that, this is really a cheap device and it just is so easy to use, especially if you're using it in conjunction with something like One Load 64, I can't recommend it enough. It's a fantastic device. Clearly you can see here, this particular one's come from the Future Was 8-bit, which you guys probably will almost certainly know about. Good guys there, selling lots of kit, but these are particularly nice cartridges. The short stubby cartridge, brilliant stuff. Obviously I've got my original dust cover to go with my trusty bread bin, which is one of my prized possessions. And here in the middle you'll see an arcade joystick. I have a couple of these. I've got a blue one as well in the cupboard. They're sold by Retro Radionics. Really, really good device. Really, really well made. I would definitely advise in getting one of these rather than necessarily trying to muck around and or fix an original joystick, which, let's be honest, after 40 years or so, or 30 years let's say, of use, quite often have kind of become worn out. This is particularly good. It uses arcade parts. Now obviously that does mean it comes at a premium. They're not cheap, but they are fantastic devices and I would highly recommend them. Absolutely, they have a lot of fun with those. I'm not scared to give them to my children to have a play, as we often do on the Commodore 64. It's great having my kids, which are both under 10, have a go on such an old and obviously legendary computer. They don't always love every single game that we play, but they do love many, and Space Pilot, funnily enough, is one of them. And I'm sure if you've played it before, you'll know why, because it's a really, really good conversion of what was Time Pilot. It's kind of an unofficial conversion of Time Pilot in the arcade. And here, of course, you'll see my trusty 1701. Brilliant device. Great to have, a CRT. We all know we can't really go wrong when it comes to using CRTs with retro equipment, using modern displays and so on. Now, whilst there's lots of means to enable you to do that, it really doesn't give you the same result as a CRT display. And of course, it's very cool to be able to use the original Commodore 1701. Some people will obviously say that the 1702 is slightly better, but hey, I really like having the original, as you can see there. And as you can see, it still has its door intact. Yes, which if you look at a lot of these, they'll actually have disappeared many, many, many moons ago. So why don't we fire this baby up? Let's give it a go. So let's see what happens when we flick the switch. Hopefully we should see, and we do. Apologies for the flicker. Obviously it's on my phone, so I'm not using anything fancy to record this today. but I just thought it'd be quick and easy to do it like this. And look, we've got Space Pilot. Brilliant stuff. Okay, so this one's slightly odd. This is, as you may have noticed, any of those have sort of looked a bit more closely at One Load 64. One of the things I am doing, whilst I'm not obviously using scene releases, I'm using original dumps wherever possible, original media to create the games. I do sometimes modify games so that they can sort of make them a bit easier to use. So, for example, I have in some cases enabled the game to be started with the joystick button, where it wasn't always the case. Some games use spacebar, some use return, some, you know, you have to swap ports, all this kind of stuff as well. So I haven't patched this one yet. I do plan to hopefully patch this at some point so that we can press the fire button. So, because at the moment you press the fire button and it takes you to the main screen, but it's press as much as I want, it's not going to do anything because I've got to press up, which is a bit weird. Now obviously I'm going to try and play this one-handed, so you can see it's running. Hellboy will be very pleased to see that it's running very well. I did commit harry-carry there quite intentionally, because to be able to press a button and steer is pretty tricky all at the same time. But yes, running good, sounding good, looking good. So there you go, guys. There's my setup, my Commodore 64 setup. And I'm really pleased to show you guys today, because I think it, you know, adds that little bit of extra dimension to the fact that yes, some of us still do use older hardware, still very much enjoy doing so. And I think anybody who kind of had these computers back in the day, you can't beat the nostalgic value of just obviously firing the baby up, the real thing, having a look. Emulators are brilliant. There's no doubt that without emulation, a lot of the preservation that we see of old computer games and, you know, just the documentation of these old computers, because, you know, at the end of the day, they're not going to last forever. Lots of very clever people do find, as we see, these aftermarket devices which help us protect them and add to them and so on and so forth. But the reality is, you know, and some people can fix them, there is only a finite amount of time these things will carry on. So emulation is very important in terms of documenting the original hardware, such that it can be reproduced, not only in terms of emulation, but also simulation, or, you know, so we're also seeing a lot of movement in the FPGA world. One particular device that springs to mind at the moment, which I think is also fantastic, I haven't invested in yet, but very much intend to do so, is the Mister, which, as some of you all know, kind of started out life as being an for ST specific and then Amiga, and that's where the MIST comes from, MI from Amiga and ST from the Amiga, the Atari ST, sorry. But obviously since then it's been added to a great deal, including the Commodore 64 and a whole bunch of arcade games as well. And I don't know if you guys have even seen, I mean, now they even have actual add-ons for the Mister to allow you to plug them directly into the jammer harness of an arcade cabinet. So it's quite mind-boggling, really, the sort of stuff that very clever people out there do to allow us to enjoy these old games. But as I say, it's always really, really nice from my perspective to have the opportunity to play them on the real hardware. And as I said earlier, it's great for my kids to see it, because kids today, you know, without kind of sounding a bit old-fashioned, clearly their idea of gaming is very different with the, you know, Xboxes and PlayStations and stuff sat under the TV, huge widescreen TVs and so on. Very much different experience. So it is always really, it gives me great pleasure to, you know, find those few really, really good games, which, as we know, are graphically not much to look at compared to the stuff we see today on modern consoles and on PC and so on. But as we know, good graphics doesn't necessarily mean good gameplay. And I think a lot of modern games we see today still suffer from that. You know, they look absolutely fantastic, but they don't necessarily always, that doesn't always translate into them being great and, you know, playable games. And of course, there's some real stinkers on the Commodore 64 as well, which is why for One Load 64, I try to be, you know, as discerning as possible and find and choose games that not only are necessarily well-known classics, because of course those are the obvious games that we add, you know, the international karates and that kind of stuff. Absolutely, you know, those, it goes without saying that those would be added. But I've also been trying really hard to find some hidden gems in there as well. And there's a whole bunch of YouTubers and other sceners and of course other people in the community. Thank you very much for all your support in terms of coming to me with suggestions and things that I might not know about. Because at the end of the day, whilst some of us back in the day had lots of games, let's be honest, we did have lots of games because, you know, piracy was rife. We didn't anywhere, none of us really had a complete collection. When you talk about, you know, people talk about perhaps, you know, in excess of 10,000 games or 20,000 games released for the platform in over its lifespan. Clearly there are so many games in there that most of us have never seen. And it's great to include some of those not so well-known games in OneLoad 64, which of course we will continue to do. And you'll have seen version 3's come out. I'm now currently working on version 4. As you'll have seen from previous releases, we generally aim for a kind of 500 new games mark for each new release. So hopefully version 4 will be out later this year with 2,000 games in it. And I know a lot of people have also been talking about, you know, the support, because the reason for the name OneLoad 64, as I'm sure most of you figured out, is because it really covers single load games. So those are the games that loaded in one go into the Commodore 64's memory, and once started running, didn't perform any further loading either from tape or from disk. But as we also know, there's so many classics that don't fall into that category, and they're multi-load games. So they do additional loading after you've started playing the game, whether it be the next level or, you know, just showing an end sequence or whatever it is. And of course, I'd very much like for OneLoad 64, even though its name suggests only single load, to also incorporate games from that category as well. But as I've sort of discussed with many people who've asked me the question, I know lots of people on the Lemon 64 forums and other places have asked me about these other games, these multi-load games they'd like to see. The challenge is, of course, what I wanted to do was get the single load games kind of covered to a fairly decent point. It feels like 2000 in version 4 will probably be the basis of the one load or single load games. The reason for that is because what I'm doing is obviously finding all of the classics that I mentioned earlier, but also listening to what other people have said in terms of what they like, what they can remember, but also cross-referencing that with various other review platforms. And the key one, obviously, is, again, Lemon 64. There's about 3,500, 4,000 games, I think, shown in their database. And the kind of rule of thumb has been that if it's around 5, rating of 5 out of 10 or more, then it's probably suitable to go into OneLoad 64. But as I say, 2000 takes us to that's about the cutoff point. Beyond that, you start to go below a rating out of, less than a rating of 5 out of 10. So it makes sense to then potentially look at other games that we can add. We will continue to add new features as well. You'll have seen in the previous version 3 release that obviously we have added title screen and loading music. So loading screen and loading music support, which I know I certainly wanted to see, and I know a lot of people have been pleased to see that, because it kind of tries to capture the original experience as best as possible, but still makes it super quick to kind of load and skip and all that kind of stuff as well. But clearly we want to start looking, or I want to start looking, and hopefully some other people will also start to want to contribute as well. I'm thinking about releasing the tool set that I've built, the tool chain, that helps me build the cartridges from raw dumps that I create in emulators for the OneLoad 64 collection. But multi-load games are a challenge, because whilst adding single load games still takes a certain amount of time, some games are really easy to dump. I don't even want to use the word crack, because really it's a misnomer in the vast majority of cases, especially those that are loaded from tape. Realistically, very few games loaded from tape have much in the way of protection, or at least once they're about to start running anyway. So I wouldn't want to call them cracks. Some of the games have been patched to allow them to work around certain, copy protection. So, for example, a simple one back in the day was, have I loaded from tape? If I haven't loaded from tape, crash or don't run. So there are little things like that that sometimes need to be patched, because obviously we're running from cartridge. So the 64 will have an awareness of the fact that it's come from cartridge as opposed from tape and so on. And silly things like that. So there are some games with protection. So those have kind of been handled. But coming back to the multi-load games, the challenge is, whilst those single load games are quite slow sometimes to add, because of protection and so on, multi-load games are much slower. And the reason for that is because each and every multi-load game, unless it happens to be using the kernel to load files, which isn't that common, especially with later games. So that's the Commodore 64's own operating system for loading files from either disk or cassette. You have to reverse engineer each routine so that you can kind of hijack it for the purposes of loading data instead of from tape or from disk from a cartridge or what have you. So to add games then, the speed at which games are added is also going to slow down greatly. So that's another reason why I kind of wanted to get the single load games out of the way, so that obviously we could enjoy those. So, not just myself, but obviously all of you guys out there, thank you very much for your support and downloading it, that you guys can enjoy it too. And then, as I've said many times before, this is a long-term project. It's been in the back of my mind for a very long time to kind of come up with a collection that kind of made things that much easier for us to play, at least those single load simple games. And I just wanted something that was a little bit different, kind of, make things a bit easier for people. So hopefully, and it's certainly based on the feedback that I received, a big percentage of you guys out there certainly appreciate what One Load 64 is trying to do. So yes, it is yet another Commodore 64 games collection, but it is something slightly different. Obviously, it's quite funny that I will sort of say sometimes, oh, well, One Load 64 is the best Commodore 64 games collection available. That is somewhat in cheek, because I know that an awful lot of people out there have put together various collections over the many years. I mean, you can go right back to even things like the Blast collection, where obviously some guys there, I think it's SCI 666, put together a very large collection. In fact, I haven't exceeded that yet. So if we hit 2000, we will exceed the number of games that were available in the Blast collection, which will be quite a nice milestone as well. But of course, we've got more recent stuff like Zombiever's C64 Dreams collection, which is also an awesome project. And I know he's borrowed some of the games from One Load 64 for inclusion in that project. But the amount of work that's going into that is just insane. Hats off to you, Zom. I know there's an awful lot of people out there that have a great deal of respect for you, quite rightly, for putting in so much time and effort into preserving not only the games themselves, but also making sure that they're configured so that they're really easy to use. There's no need to kind of swap ports and all this kind of stuff, but also the capturing of, the covers, the manuals, and now, as we can see, even the magazine reviews or reviews from magazines such as Zap 64 and so on. Fantastic collection. I definitely recommend, if you haven't yet checked out C64 Dreams, you should grab a copy, because for all intents and purposes, whilst One Load 64 is very much more simplistic and can be used in many different ways, including on old hardware, as we can see here, and in emulators, Zom's C64 Dreams is very much aimed at that kind of, through emulation type of thing. And, it, in terms of using it on modern hardware, even on TVs and so on, perhaps, in terms of front ends and stuff, it really is amazing, the work that's gone into that. So you should definitely check it out if you haven't done so already. Okay, so you've probably listened to me prattle on way enough. Apologies. As you can tell, it is a subject that's very dear to me, and I do like to talk about it quite a lot. So I'll leave you in peace at that point, but I hope you found that informative and gives you a little sense of how things are done here. I do plan to be releasing some new videos soon, one and most important of which will be a little sort of guide, sort of basic intro guide around how we actually add games to One Load 64, so you can see a little bit more about how that's done, give you a little bit of insight. I know there'll be many of you out there that will already have a good sense of how this was done back in the day, and how crackers and so on do it already. But there'll be many of you that won't, and you'll see it's actually not that difficult in the vast majority of cases, especially when, as I say, when it comes to tape games and so on. But that should hopefully be informative. I hope to release that in the next month or so. So that should give you a little bit more background. As I say, I'll continue to work on One Load 64 version 4. And listen, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications from my channel, because lots of people sort of said they don't necessarily see it being released. Well, hey, if you subscribe and notify, you'll know as soon as I release version 4 or any other subsequent update video. So please do that. It'd be nice at some point if I could exceed 1,000 subscribers, because it's another milestone that I'd like to achieve with my channel. But listen, great to speak to you guys. Take care wherever you are. Don't forget, Commodore will never die. Enjoy the Commodore 64 games in whatever way you can, and I'll speak to you again soon. Take care.